What if I told you that in 1941, Japan knew it could not outproduce, outnumber, or outlast the United States and still chose to go to war anyway? What kind of nation looks at the world's greatest industrial power and says, we can beat them? This is not just a story about ships and bombs. It's a story about pride, desperation, miscalculation, and one of the boldest gambles in military history. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how Japan believed a single crushing blow at Pearl Harbor could break America's will, and why that belief changed the world forever. Stay with me, because the real story is far more shocking than you think. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we step back into one of the most audacious gambles in modern history. A moment when an island empire looked across the vast Pacific Ocean and believed it could defeat the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. The question echoes through time. How did Japan think it could beat the United States in World War II? To understand that belief, we must step into the world of 1941, into the minds of men who stood at the crossroads of pride, fear, desperation, and destiny. In the early 20th century, Japan was not the broken nation we imagine. In 1945, it was rising, fierce, disciplined, and hungry for recognition. In 1905, it had shocked the world by defeating the mighty Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. It had proven that an Asian power could humble a European empire. By the 1930s, Japan's military leadership believed it was chosen, guided by destiny and divine mandate under Emperor Hirohito. But Japan was also desperate. It had few natural resources, no oil fields, limited steel, limited rubber. Its growing empire in China was bleeding men and money after the brutal invasion of Second Sino-Japanese War. The war dragged on, swallowing lives without delivering total victory. And then came the embargo collision. And then came the embargo. The United States, disturbed by Japan's aggression, froze Japanese assets and cut off vital oil supplies. For Japan, this was not merely economic pressure, it was a ticking clock. Without oil, its navy would become useless. Its empire would suffocate. Military leaders faced a terrifying calculation. In Tokyo, military leaders faced a terrifying calculation: withdraw from China and abandon imperial ambitions, or strike, and strike hard, before America could fully mobilize. Japan's strategy was rooted in a doctrine known as Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. It was inspired by earlier naval theory and Japan's victory over Russia. The idea was simple, even elegant: Pacific Fleet in one devastating surprise attack. Seize strategic territories across Southeast Asia. Fortify a defensive perimeter so vast and costly to penetrate that America would negotiate peace rather than fight a long war. Japan's leaders did not believe they could conquer the United States mainland. That was never the goal. The goal was psychological shock, to break American will. And so, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft roared across the sky above Pearl Harbor. The attack was tactically brilliant. Battleships burned. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered in the harbor. Around the world, jaws dropped. Japan had achieved the impossible. It had struck the giant. But here lies the tragedy of miscalculation. Japan misunderstood America. Japanese planners believed the United States was soft, divided, isolationist, unwilling to endure massive casualties for distant islands. They saw a nation still scarred by the Great Depression, reluctant to enter Europe's war. They believed Americans lacked the spiritual unity and warrior ethos of Japan's Bushido Code. What they failed to grasp was America's industrial power, and its capacity for anger, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Something changed. The debate ended overnight. The United States did not fracture. It unified unified factories that once produced refrigerators and cars now built bombers and aircraft carriers. Shipyards worked around the clock. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. The American economy, vast, mechanized, relentless, became a weapon. Japan had planned for a short war, 6 months of rapid victories, a year perhaps before negotiations. Instead, it awakened a sleeping industrial titan. In the first months of 1942, Japan's confidence seemed justified. Its forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire stretched across the Pacific like a steel net. But beneath that expansion lay a fatal weakness. Japan could not replace its losses the way America could. When veteran pilots were shot down, they were irreplaceable. When aircraft carriers were sunk, shipyards could not build them quickly enough. Japan's economy, though formidable, simply could not match America's scale. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers sailed into a trap. American codebreakers had deciphered their plans. In a matter of hours, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the very core of their naval power, were destroyed. 4 carriers, hundreds of elite pilots, gone. It was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the shattering of Japan's strategic illusion. From that moment forward, the war became one of attrition, and attrition favored the United States. So how did Japan think it could win? It believed in speed. It believed in shock. It believed in spirit over steel. It believed America would lack the will. And perhaps most importantly, it believed it had no alternative. Japanese leaders knew war with the United States was dangerous. Some even called it suicidal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto famously warned he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have no expectation of success. 6 months. That was the window. After Midway, the clock ran out. By 1945, American bombers darkened the skies over Japan itself. Cities burned in firebombing raids. And then, in August, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new and terrible era of warfare. The empire that once believed it could bend the Pacific to its will lay devastated, but history is not merely about victory and defeat. It is about understanding. Japan did not believe it could conquer America outright. It believed it could shock, intimidate, and outmaneuver it long enough to force negotiation. It gambled that spirit and surprise could outweigh industrial might. It was a gamble born of ambition, pride, and fear. And in the end, it was a gamble that reshaped the world. The lesson is sobering. Nations do not always go to war because they are certain of victory. Sometimes they go to war because they believe the alternative is slow suffocation. Sometimes they gamble because they think time is running out. In 1941, across the Pacific, 2 very different visions of power collided. One believed in decisive battle. The other believed in total mobilization. Steel met spirit, industry met ideology, and the Pacific Ocean became a graveyard of illusions. That is how Japan thought it could beat the United States in World War II. And that is why it could not if you stillness in these words. Subscribe to join the space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. In 1941, Japan stood at the edge of a cliff. It could clearly see, yet felt powerless to step back from. The empire had risen rapidly in the early 20th century, transforming itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial and military power. Victories like the Russo-Japan Sea War had convinced many within its leadership that destiny favored boldness. But beneath the confidence lay a dangerous truth. Japan's strength was built on borrowed resources. Unlike the United States, Japan possessed very little of the raw material required to sustain a modern industrial war. It had almost no domestic oil. Its supplies of iron ore, rubber, and other essential resources were limited. Every warship that steamed across the Pacific, every aircraft that roared into the sky, every tank that rolled across Chinese soil depended on imported fuel. Oil was not merely an economic necessity, it was the lifeblood of the Japanese Empire. By the late 1930s, Japan was already deeply entrenched in China through the brutal conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. What many in Tokyo had expected to be a quick and decisive campaign turned into a grinding, expensive struggle. Troops were bogged down across vast territories. Supplies had to be shipped across long distances. The army consumed fuel at an alarming rate, and yet withdrawal from China was politically unthinkable. Too much blood had been spilled. Too much national pride was invested. At the same time, Japan's ambitions expanded southward. Military leaders envisioned a self-sufficient empire stretching across Southeast Asia, rich in oil, rubber, and minerals. The Dutch East Indies offered vast oil fields. Malaya provided rubber and tin. Indochina offered strategic positioning. The concept was clear. If Japan could secure these territories, it could free itself from dependence on Western powers. But this expansion alarmed the United States. American policymakers increasingly viewed Japan not as a regional power defending its interests, but as an aggressive force destabilizing Asia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced growing pressure to respond to Japanese expansion. Step-by-step economic measures were introduced. Export controls were tightened. Scrap metal shipments were restricted. Aviation fuel was limited. Then came the blow that changed everything. In July 1941, after Japan occupied southern French Indochina, the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo. For Japan, this was catastrophic. Nearly 80% of its oil imports came from the United States. Overnight, the empire's reserves became a countdown clock. Japanese planners did the math with cold precision. At current consumption rates, Japan's oil reserves would last roughly 18 months, perhaps less if military operations intensified. After that, the Navy would be immobilized. Aircraft would be grounded. The empire would be defenseless. A modern military without fuel is not a military at all, it is a museum. This was not simply an economic inconvenience. It was a strategic suffocation. Within Tokyo's highest councils, debate intensified. Civilian leaders understood that war with the United States would be extraordinarily dangerous. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. Its population was larger. Its potential output of ships, planes, and weapons was staggering. Yet from the military's perspective, waiting was even more dangerous. Every month that passed allowed the United States to strengthen its Pacific defenses. Every barrel of oil burned in China reduced Japan's survival window. The embargo created a psychological shift. Before it, expansion had been a choice. After it, expansion felt like necessity. Japanese leaders framed the situation starkly. Accept American demands and withdraw from China, effectively abandoning years of sacrifice and imperial ambition, or seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia before the reserves ran dry. Withdrawal would mean humiliation and political collapse at home. Military hardliners believed it would reduce Japan to a second-rate power, forever subordinate to Western influence. To seizing Southeast Asia, however, would almost certainly provoke war with the United States and Britain. The oil fields Japan needed were under Western control. To take them by force meant confronting Western navies, particularly the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. In this desperate calculus, the embargo acted not merely as pressure, but as a trigger. It forced Japanese leaders to think in terms of shrinking time horizons. Long-term diplomacy gave way to short-term survival strategy. The question was no longer whether conflict might occur someday. It became whether Japan should strike before its strength withered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the imbalance of industrial power. He had studied in the United States. He knew its factories and shipyards. Yet even he recognized that once the embargo was in place, Japan faced a narrowing path. If war was inevitable, it had to begin under conditions chosen by Japan, not imposed by America. The oil embargo turned delay into weakness. There was also a powerful undercurrent of national psychology. Japan had spent decades asserting itself as a modern great power. It had defeated Russia. It had expanded its influence in Korea and Manchuria. To bow to American economic pressure would be seen by many within the military as surrender without battle. In a culture that prized honor and resolve, yielding to sanctions felt like national humiliation. Thus, the embargo did more than restrict fuel. It ignited pride, fear, and urgency. It convinced decision-makers that the window for decisive action was closing. They believed that by striking swiftly, capturing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and establishing a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, Japan could secure the resources it needed to sustain a long-term position of strength. The tragedy lay in the contradiction at the heart of the strategy. To solve the oil crisis, Japan would have to wage a massive naval and air campaign, precisely the kind of operations that consumed enormous quantities of fuel. The very act of securing resources required spending the resources they were running out of to limits. Still, from Tokyo's perspective in late 1941, inaction guaranteed slow decline. Action, however risky, offered a chance, however slim, at strategic independence. The embargo compressed time, intensified fear, and transformed ambition into desperation. It reshaped the calculations of generals and admirals who might otherwise have hesitated. It turned economic policy into a countdown toward war. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join Time Space of Presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. In the autumn of 1941, as negotiations between Tokyo and Washington drifted toward failure, Japanese naval planners were refining one of the boldest operations in modern military history. They understood that if Japan moved south to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia, war with the United States would almost certainly follow. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, stood as the single greatest obstacle to Japan's expansion. If that fleet remained intact, it could steam westward, challenge Japanese advances, and strangle the empire's new defensive perimeter before it solidified. Japanese strategists believed they had only one realistic path: destroy or cripple the Pacific Fleet at the very beginning of the war. The idea was not simply tactical, it was psychological. Shock the Americans so violently that they would hesitate, lose confidence, and reconsider the cost of a prolonged Pacific conflict. In Tokyo's calculations, a devastating surprise attack could buy 6 months, perhaps a year of uncontested expansion. In that window, Japan will capture the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies fortify a vast defensive ring and present the United States with a grim choice: fight across thousands of miles of ocean at enormous cost. Fight across thousands of miles of ocean at enormous cost, or negotiate a settlement that recognized Japan's new empire. The architect of this bold plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Yamamoto was no reckless fanatic. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood America's industrial might better than most of his countrymen. He reportedly warned that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no expectation of success. His proposal for a surprise carrier strike was born not from arrogance alone, but from urgency. If war was unavoidable, it had to begin with a blow so powerful that it would temporarily paralyze American response. The operation required extraordinary secrecy and precision. Japan assembled 6 aircraft carriers into a single striking force, something unprecedented at the time. These carriers, Akagi Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, formed the core of a mobile armada capable of projecting air power across vast distances. Hundreds of pilots trained relentlessly in torpedo runs and bombing techniques. Engineers modified torpedoes to function in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Every detail was rehearsed. The strategy hinged on surprise. No declaration of war would precede the attack. Diplomatic talks would continue in Washington even as the strike force steamed silently across the North Pacific. Japanese planners believed that surprise would multiply the physical damage with psychological shock. Battleships sunk at anchor would symbolize American vulnerability. Flames rising from the harbor would send a message across the Pacific. Japan had seized the initiative. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the sky above Oahu filled with the sound of engines. The first wave of aircraft descended on battleships, lined up along Battleship Row. Torpedoes slammed into hulls, bombs pierced decks. The USS Arizona exploded in a catastrophic blast, killing more than 1,000 sailors. Within hours, much of the Pacific Fleet's battleship force lay burning or sunk. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. From a purely tactical perspective, the strike achieved significant success. It crippled battleships, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and stunned the American public. For a brief moment, Japanese leaders could believe their gamble had worked. The Pacific Fleet had been caught off guard. The United States had been humiliated. Yet even within the apparent triumph, cracks were visible. The most important American aircraft carriers were not in port that day. They had been at sea and thus escaped destruction. The attack also failed to destroy critical infrastructure such as fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and repair yards. These would prove essential in restoring American naval strength far more quickly than Japanese planners anticipated. Still, in Tokyo, the immediate reaction was confidence. The decisive blow had been delivered. Simultaneously, Japanese forces launched coordinated attacks across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines were invaded. British positions in Malaya were assaulted. Hong Kong fell. The empire expanded with breathtaking speed. The underlying belief behind the Pearl Harbor strategy rested on assumptions about American society. Japanese leaders perceived the United States as materially strong but spiritually weak, prosperous, individualistic, and reluctant to endure heavy losses for distant territories. They assumed that a sudden, devastating attack would sap American morale and intensify isolationist sentiment. Instead of rallying for a long war, Americans would demand retribution only up to a point, then push for compromise once casualties mounted. This was a profound misreading. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, calling December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, the nation unified with remarkable speed. Isolationist voices fell silent. War bonds were purchased in massive quantities. Factories began converting to wartime production at an unprecedented scale. Rather than deterring the United States, the attack ignited a fury that transformed public opinion almost overnight. Japanese planners had envisioned a short, sharp conflict that would establish a fortified perimeter stretching from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific and down into Southeast Asia. Behind this shield, they believed they could consolidate their gains, exploit captured resources, and force the United States into a war of distance and attrition that Americans would find intolerable. The initial destruction at Pearl Harbor was meant to delay any counteroffensive long enough for this perimeter to harden into an unbreakable barrier. But the attack, while bold, did not eliminate America's capacity to respond. Shipyards on the West Coast accelerated production. New aircraft carriers were already under construction. The industrial machine that Yamamoto feared began to turn with relentless momentum. What Japan had intended as a disabling strike became instead a spark that ignited total mobilization. The Pearl Harbor strategy was built on speed, coordination, and psychological impact. It reflected Japan's belief in decisive action, an overwhelming first blow that would define the course of the war. It was a gamble that relied on precision and timing, on the hope that shock could substitute for long-term material superiority. It demonstrated extraordinary operational planning and daring execution, but it also revealed the limits of tactical brilliance when measured against industrial depth and national resolve. In the hours after the attack, as smoke rose over Pearl Harbor and news spread across the globe, Japan appeared unstoppable. Its navy had struck the strongest Pacific power and survived. Its armies advanced across Asia. The empire's leaders believed they had reshaped the strategic balance in a single morning, forcing the United States onto the defensive and seizing control of the tempo of war. They believed that by crippling the Pacific Fleet at its anchor, they had carved out the time and space needed to secure victory on their own terms. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. For decades before the Pacific War erupted, the Imperial Japanese Navy was shaped by a single powerful idea that wars at sea could be decided in one overwhelming climactic clash. This doctrine, known as Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, was not merely a strategy. It was a philosophy. It blended naval theory, historical memory, and cultural belief into a vision of how Japan could defeat a stronger opponent through precision, preparation, and spiritual resolve. The roots of Kantai Kessen stretched back to Japan's stunning victory in the Russo-Japanese War. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet annihilated Russia's Baltic fleet in a single, crushing encounter. The triumph electrified Japan and shocked the world. It seemed to prove that a well-prepared, highly trained navy could destroy a numerically comparable opponent in one decisive engagement. Tsushima became more than a victory. It became a template. Japanese naval officers studied the battle obsessively. They absorbed the writings of American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who emphasized the importance of decisive fleet engagements in determining control of the seas. Mahan's ideas resonated deeply within the Imperial Japanese Navy. If command of the sea could be won through a single climactic battle, then Japan, despite its smaller industrial base, could concentrate its strength, strike at the right moment. and secure victory without fighting a prolonged war of attrition. By the 1920s and 1930s, this doctrine hardened into orthodoxy. Japanese war plans assumed that in the event of conflict with the United States, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would steam westward across the ocean to relieve American-held territories such as the Philippines. As it advanced, Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft would harass and weaken it. Then, near Japan's home waters, the Imperial Navy would deliver the decisive blow, a massive surface engagement in which battleships would annihilate the exhausted American fleet. Everything was built around this expectation. Battleships were constructed with heavy armor and powerful guns designed for line-of-battle combat. Crews were trained intensively for night fighting. Long-range torpedoes were developed to deliver devastating strikes before the enemy could respond. The entire strategic vision rested on the belief that war would culminate in one monumental confrontation that would determine its outcome. When tensions with the United States escalated in 1941, Kantai Kessen shaped Japanese thinking at the highest levels. Leaders understood that America possessed greater industrial capacity, but they believed that industrial strength would matter less if the U.S. Navy could be crippled early in a decisive engagement. The war did not need to be long. It needed to be long. It needed to be sharp and conclusive. The attack on Pearl Harbor was in many ways an adaptation of Kantai Kessen to the age of air power. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto recognized that while waiting for the U.S. fleet to approach Japan's waters might be too risky in an era when aircraft carriers had transformed naval warfare. Instead of allowing the Americans to initiate the advance, Japan would strike first, hoping to trigger the decisive phase of the war immediately. Pearl Harbor was not the decisive battle itself, but it was meant to set the stage for one. By crippling the Pacific Fleet, Japan hoped to prevent effective American interference while it seized a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Once that perimeter was fortified, any American counteroffensive would require a long and costly advance. As U.S. forces pushed westward, they would be attrited, worn down by submarines, land-based aircraft, and island defenses. Eventually, the weakened fleet would face the concentrated power of the Imperial Navy in a climactic showdown near Japan. The doctrine rested on several critical assumptions. First, that the United States would follow a predictable path across the Pacific, adhering to pre-war contingency plans. Second, that American morale would falter after heavy losses in a distant ocean. Third, that Japan's superior training, night fighting capability, and torpedo technology would offset any numerical disadvantages. Underlying these assumptions was a cultural dimension. Many Japanese officers believed deeply in the power of spirit, seishin. They argued that determination, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material inferiority. The concept resonated with the Bushido ethos that had permeated military culture. In this view, a decisive battle was not merely about ships and guns. It was a test of national character. Yet the world of 1941 was not the world of 1905. Naval warfare had evolved. Aircraft carriers, submarines, radar, and industrial-scale production had reshaped the balance of power. While Japan excelled in training and tactical innovation, it lacked the industrial depth to sustain prolonged losses. Kantai Kessen assumed that one great clash would determine the outcome, but it underestimated the possibility of a long, grinding war in which production capacity would dominate. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to validate the doctrine. Japanese forces advanced rapidly. Allied fleets suffered defeats in the Java Sea and elsewhere. The Imperial Navy appeared unstoppable. Confidence grew that when the decisive encounter came, Japan would prevail as it had at Tsushima. Instead of one climactic surface engagement, the war became a series of carrier battles and amphibious assaults across vast distances. The confrontation at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a profound shift. There, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were destroyed in a matter of hours. The loss crippled Japan's ability to project power and undermined the very foundation of its strategy. Midway was not the decisive victory Japan had sought. It was a devastating setback. Yet even after this blow, elements of Kantai Kessen thinking persisted. Japanese planners continued to prepare for a final, massive fleet engagement that would reverse the tide. As American forces advanced through the Central Pacific, Japan fortified island positions, hoping to bleed the enemy and force a climactic naval confrontation closer to home waters. The tragedy of Kantai Kessen lay in its rigidity. It offered clarity and confidence, but it constrained strategic imagination. By focusing on the ideal of a single decisive encounter, Japan struggled to adapt fully to a war defined by logistics, air superiority, and industrial output. The doctrine had emerged from historical success and theoretical elegance, yet it proved ill-suited to the scale and complexity of global industrial conflict. In the minds of its architects, Kantai Kessen was the equalizer, a way for a resource-limited nation to defeat a materially superior adversary through concentration, timing, and willpower. It promised a shortcut to victory, a dramatic climax that would spare Japan the ordeal of prolonged attrition. It shaped shipbuilding programs, training regimens, and operational planning for decades. It instilled confidence that even against the United States, Japan could engineer a moment so decisive that the balance of power would shift in a single thunderous exchange of fire across the Pacific waters. In the strategic calculations made in Tokyo before December 1941, one of the most consequential errors was not about ships or aircraft or oil reserves. It was about people. Japanese leaders misjudged the character, unity, and industrial capacity of the United States. They did not doubt that America was wealthy or technologically advanced. What they underestimated was how quickly that wealth could be transformed into war power and how completely a divided society could unify when attacked. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was deeply divided over involvement in global conflict. The trauma of World War I still lingered. Many Americans believed that entering European wars had been a mistake. Isolationist movements were strong. Organizations like the America First Committee argued passionately against intervention. Congress debated. Newspapers published fierce arguments. To observers in Tokyo, this appeared as weakness, evidence of a society unwilling to sacrifice blood and treasure for distant causes. Japanese intelligence assessments concluded that American public opinion lacked the endurance for a long, costly war in Asia. They believed that if the Pacific Fleet were crippled and casualties mounted early, public pressure would force Washington to negotiate. Democracies, in this view, were fragile. They were driven by public sentiment, and public sentiment could be shocked into retreat. There was also a cultural dimension to this miscalculation. Japanese military culture emphasized discipline, obedience, and a code of sacrifice rooted in Bushido. Many officers believed that American society, with its emphasis on individualism and consumer comfort, lacked the spiritual cohesion necessary for prolonged hardship. They assumed that materialism would undermine resolve, spirit would triumph over industry. What they did not fully comprehend was how American identity could transform under threat. On December 7th, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, the political divisions that had defined the previous years evaporated almost overnight. The attack was not perceived as a distant imperial dispute. It was seen as a direct assault on American soil. on American sailors, on American honor. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy. His speech was brief but electrifying. War was declared with near unanimity. Isolationist leaders who had argued against involvement now rallied behind the government. The country that Japanese planners had viewed as fractured and hesitant unified with remarkable speed. Unity alone, however, was not the decisive factor. The greater miscalculation lay in underestimating the scale of American industrial mobilization. Japan's leadership understood that the United States possessed vast factories and natural resources, but they believed that converting this potential into actual military power would take years. They assumed that early victories would create a fortified perimeter so strong that America would hesitate to challenge it before negotiations could begin. They misread the tempo of American production. Within thaws of Pearl Harbor, American industry began transforming at a pace unprecedented in history. Automobile factories ceased civilian production and shifted to tanks and aircraft engines. Shipyards expanded around the clock. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. The United States was not merely producing weapons. It was reinventing its entire economic structure to sustain global war. By 1943 and 1944, American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines at staggering rates. Liberty ships were constructed in weeks rather than months. Aircraft production soared into the tens of thousands annually. Where Japan struggled to replace experienced pilots and lost carriers, the United States trained new crews and commissioned new ships continuously. Losses that might have crippled a smaller nation became absorbable setbacks. Japanese planners had assumed that a dramatic early blow would discourage America from engaging in a drawn-out struggle across the Pacific's vast distances. Instead, the attack galvanized public determination. War bond drives raised billions of dollars. Rationing was accepted as a patriotic duty. Young men enlisted in enormous numbers. Universities and laboratories redirected research toward radar, code breaking, and new weapons technologies. There was also a failure to appreciate the geographic security of the United States. Unlike Japan, whose home islands were vulnerable to blockade and bombing once American forces advanced, the continental United States was shielded by oceans. Its industrial centers were safe from direct attack in the early years of the war. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles could operate without fear of invasion. This security allowed uninterrupted expansion of military production. Another aspect of misjudgment lay in technological adaptation. American forces quickly improved carrier tactics, submarine warfare, and logistics. The USA Navy developed effective convoy systems and refined amphibious assault strategies. The industrial base allowed rapid iteration, new radar systems, improved aircraft designs, better coordination between branches. Japan's qualitative edge in training at the start of the war gradually eroded as American training programs expanded. Japanese leaders also underestimated the emotional impact of Pearl Harbor on American society. The attack was perceived not as a limited military action, but as a treacherous strike carried out during ongoing negotiations. The sense of betrayal intensified public anger. What might have been viewed as a strategic conflict became personal. Revenge became intertwined with strategy. In Tokyo, there had been hope that the United States would calculate costs rationally and conclude that reclaiming distant islands was not worth the bloodshed. Instead, American leaders framed the war as a matter of national survival and global principle. It became linked to the broader struggle against Axis aggression. The Pacific War was no longer a regional dispute. It was part of a worldwide effort to defeat expansionist powers. The miscalculation was profound because it was psychological. Japan understood American steel, but not American will. It measured ship tonnage, but not social cohesion. It calculated production capacity, but not the speed at which a democracy could mobilize when unified by outrage. By the time battles such as the Battle of Midway shifted the strategic balance, the consequences of underestimation were already clear. The United States was not faltering. It was accelerating. Each month brought more ships, more aircraft, more trained personnel. The imbalance that Japanese planners had hoped to avoid through a quick, decisive blow grew wider with every passing year. In assuming that American society would fracture under shock and loss, Japan misread the resilience embedded within a vast, diverse nation. The attack that was meant to intimidate instead unified. The losses that were meant to discourage instead hardened resolve. The industrial power that was assumed to be slow and unwieldy proved flexible, adaptive, and relentless, transforming economic might into sustained military force at a scale that reshaped the Pacific War. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its forces swept across Southeast Asia with astonishing speed. British strongholds fell. American positions in the Philippines collapsed. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, were seized. The empire stretched across a vast arc of ocean and jungle, forming the defensive perimeter its planners had envisioned. For a brief moment, it appeared that the gamble had worked, that the shock delivered at Pearl Harbor had bought the time Japan needed to consolidate its gains. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the strategic clock was ticking. Japanese leaders knew that their advantage lay in momentum. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned that Japan could run wild, for 6 months. But beyond that window, the balance would begin to shift. The United States, with its immense industrial base, would mobilize. New ships would slide down American slipways. Pilots would graduate from accelerated training programs. The war would evolve from a contest of surprise to a contest of production, By early 1942, American morale had been shaken but not broken. Aircraft carriers, absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack, remained operational. These floating airfields would become the centerpiece of the coming struggle. Instead of waiting for the United States to rebuild fully, Yamamoto sought to draw the American fleet into a trap. The objective was to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and, more importantly, lure American carriers into a decisive engagement. The plan reflected the lingering influence of Kantai Kessen, the belief in a climactic battle that would determine the war's outcome. If the remaining U.S. carriers could be destroyed, Japan would regain naval dominance in the Pacific. Without carrier air power, American counteroffensives would stall. Negotiations might follow, but this time, surprise would not belong entirely to Japan. American cryptanalysis had been working tirelessly to break Japanese naval codes. In a quiet intelligence battle far from the front lines, codebreakers deciphered critical communications. They confirmed that AF in Japanese dispatches referred to Midway. Armed with this knowledge, U.S. commanders prepared an ambush. In early June 1942, the opposing fleets converged near the atoll. Japan committed 4 of its premier aircraft carriers. Akaga committed 4U and Hiryu, the same vessels that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their aircrews were experienced, confident, battle-tested. Japanese planners expected to overwhelm Midway, draw out American carriers, and destroy them in sequence. The morning of June 4th began with Japanese aircraft bombing Midway's installations. Damage was inflicted, but the base was not neutralized. As Japanese carriers prepared to rearm their planes for additional strikes, American carrier aircraft launched from USS Enterprise USS Hornet and USS Yorktown approached the battlefield in fragmented waves. The early American attacks were chaotic and costly. Torpedo squadrons were shot down in devastating numbers. Pilots pressed forward through intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, many knowing their chances of survival were slim. Their sacrifice, however, had an unintended strategic effect. Japanese combat air patrols were drawn down to low altitude, leaving the skies above less guarded. Then came the moment that would alter the Pacific War. American dive bombers, arriving almost simultaneously from different directions, found the Japanese carriers at a vulnerable instant, flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. In a matter of minutes, bombs struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Fires erupted. Explosions tore through hangars. 3 carriers were mortally wounded before noon. Hiryu launched counterattacks that severely damaged USS Yorktown, but by the end of the day, American aircraft located and fatally struck Hiryu as well. 4 Japanese carriers, veterans of the opening offensive, were lost. Hundreds of skilled pilots and crew perished. The core of Japan's carrier striking force vanished in hours. The scale of the loss was staggering. Japan could not easily replace experienced aviators. Training programs were rigorous but slow. Industrial capacity limited the rapid construction of new fleet carriers. The qualitative edge Japan had enjoyed at the war's outset began to erode. Midway did not instantly reverse the balance of power, but it shattered Japan's momentum. The initiative shifted. Instead of expanding outward confidently, Japan was forced onto the defensive. American forces, bolstered by accelerating production, prepared for sustained offensives across the Pacific. Psychologically, the impact was profound. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Imperial Navy dissolved. The decisive battle Japan had sought became the decisive defeat it had not anticipated. The war would no longer hinge on a single climactic triumph, but would unfold through relentless attrition. American industry, already mobilizing at extraordinary speed, continued to surge. New Essex-class carriers entered service. Aircraft production expanded, submarine warfare intensified, gradually strangling Japan's shipping lanes. Each lost tanker, each sunken cargo vessel tightened the resource constraints that had driven Japan to war in the first place. For Japanese planners, Midway exposed the fragility of their assumptions. Surprise could not be guaranteed. Intelligence could fail. Operational complexity introduced risk. The belief that one decisive encounter would settle the conflict proved illusory in the face of industrial depth and adaptive strategy. As American forces advanced through the Solomon Islands and beyond, Japan attempted to bleed them through defensive battles, hoping to impose costs high enough to force reconsideration in Washington. But the imbalance in production widened with every passing month. Losses that might once have been catastrophic for the United States became manageable. For Japan, each carrier sunk, each veteran pilot lost, represented a wound that could not fully heal. The Battle of Midway marked the moment when the Pacific War shifted from rapid expansion to grinding reversal. It was the turning point at which Japan's window of opportunity closed. The 6 months Yamamoto had predicted were over. From that point forward, the strategic initiative belonged increasingly to the United States, whose shipyards, factories, and training bases operated with relentless momentum. The decisive battle Japan had envisioned became instead the beginning of a long descent into defensive struggle, fought across vast stretches of ocean under skies increasingly dominated by American aircraft. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.